In 1987, 2 FBI agents were dispatched to Michigan's northern woods to investigate a series of livestock mutilations that local authorities couldn't explain. What began as a routine assignment became something neither man could ever report in official channels. The creatures they encountered defied every natural law they knew, and the government's response defied every principle they'd sworn to uphold. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. My name is Thomas Garrett, and for 23 years I carried a federal badge. I investigated organized crime and cases that tested the limits of what I thought human beings were capable of. I believed in evidence, procedure, and the rule of law. I believed the Bureau stood for truth, even when that truth was ugly or inconvenient. What happened in Michigan broke that belief beyond repair. It showed me that some truths are deemed too dangerous to acknowledge, and that the institutions we trust to protect us will sacrifice anything, including their own agents, to maintain the illusion of control over forces they barely understand. The call came through headquarters on March 12, 1987, a Thursday morning that started like any other. I was at my desk in the Detroit field office reviewing case files on a suspected interstate fraud ring when my supervisor, Frank Morrison, appeared at my door with a folder marked with a priority classification I'd only seen twice before in my career. Both times had involved matters of national security. He told me to pack for a week in the field and meet my partner at the motor pool in an hour. No details, no briefing, just coordinates for a town called Luther that I'd never heard of and instructions to maintain communications blackout until we reported findings. I asked what the case involved. Morrison looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between concern and resignation, and said livestock killings. Strange ones. Multiple sites. Local law enforcement requesting federal assistance. That's all I got. My partner was Sarah Chen, 31 years old, former Army intelligence specialist, 8 years with the Bureau and already making a name for herself in forensic analysis. She specialized in crime scene reconstruction and had a methodical, analytical approach that complemented my interview and investigation techniques. We'd worked together on 3 previous cases, all resolved successfully, and I trusted her judgment more than most agents twice her experience. She was already loading gear into the sedan when I arrived at the motor pool. 2 large cases of equipment, overnight bags, and our standard field kit. She handed me the folder Morrison had given her, identical to mine. Inside were photographs of dead cattle, sheep, and horses. The images showed massive trauma, torn flesh, crushed bones, but the pattern of damage didn't match any predator either of us recognized. The wounds were too clean in some places, too violent in others, as if whatever killed these animals had both surgical precision and overwhelming rage. We drove north through the afternoon and into evening, leaving the interstate for state highways that narrowed into county roads that became 2-lane blacktops cutting through endless forest. The landscape changed from suburban sprawl to farmland to dense stands of pine and hardwood that pressed close to the road on both sides. By the time we reached Wexford County, night had fallen completely, and the darkness outside the headlights was absolute in a way you don't see near cities. The town of Luther consisted of a gas station with 2 pumps, a diner that looked like it had been there since the 1950s, a general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign, and perhaps 300 residents scattered across the surrounding woods in homes we couldn't see from the road. The local sheriff's department operated out of a small building that shared space with the volunteer fire station. We checked into a motel on the edge of town, a place called the Pine Rest that looked like it hadn't been updated since Kennedy was president, and agreed to meet the sheriff first thing in the morning after getting what sleep we could. Sheriff William Boyd was 56 years old, gray-haired and weather-beaten, with the deeply lined face of someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors, and the careful way of speaking that rural law enforcement develops after decades of handling situations with limited resources. He'd been expecting us, had coffee already made when we arrived at his office at 7 in the morning. He led us inside, poured 3 cups without asking if we wanted any, and spread out a county map on his desk that was covered in red marks. Over the past 6 weeks, he explained in a voice that never wavered, there had been 17 separate incidents of livestock killings across a roughly 30-mile radius. The attacks occurred exclusively at night, mostly in isolated areas far from main roads, on properties that bordered state forest land. No witnesses to the actual killings, no tracks that made any sense to him or the state wildlife officers he'd consulted, and a level of violence that went beyond anything he'd seen in 32 years of law enforcement in 3 different counties. What bothered him most, he said, was the pattern. The kills were escalating, not in frequency, but in the degree of savagery, and they were moving progressively closer to populated areas, as if whatever was doing this was becoming bolder or less concerned with concealment. We asked to see the sites immediately. Boyd drove us to the first location in his patrol vehicle, a well-maintained Crown Victoria with a police package that had seen better days but still ran smooth. The farm belonged to a family named Peterson, 4th-generation cattle ranchers who'd worked this land since the 1890s. The barn stood at the end of a long gravel drive, surrounded by fields that stretched a quarter-mile to the tree line on 3 sides. The Petersons had lost 3 cows in a single night 2 weeks prior. The rancher, Tom Peterson, was a man in his 40s with hands like hammers and shoulders built from decades of physical labor. His voice shook when he described what he'd found that morning. His cattle had been kept in a reinforced pen with 8-foot chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire, the kind of setup designed to contain valuable livestock and deter any predator in Michigan. Whatever got to them had gone through the fence without apparent difficulty, leaving a section peeled back as if the heavy-gauge metal were tissue paper. The cows themselves had been torn apart with such force that parts of them were scattered 50 feet from the pen in different directions. Bone fragments, tissue masses, blood spread across an area the size of a tennis court in patterns that suggested violent motion rather than feeding behavior. Sarah photographed the scene from multiple angles and collected samples of tissue and blood for analysis. I examined the fence closely, measuring and documenting the damage. The metal was commercial-grade galvanized steel, 2-inch mesh, designed to contain aggressive bulls and deter wolves and coyotes. The section that had been breached showed marks consistent with tremendous gripping force applied from the outside, from above the fence line. The edges were bent outward and down in a way that suggested something had grabbed the top rail, with appendages capable of exerting hundreds of pounds of pressure and simply pulled until the structure failed. I measured the spacing of the handhold patterns with a tape measure and photographed them. They were roughly 5 to 6 inches wide, spaced in a configuration that suggested fingers or appendages with an opposable grip and significant reach. The spacing between individual grip marks was wider than a human hand but showed a similar articulation pattern. No bear, no wolf, no mountain lion, no known predator in North America had paws or claws that matched those dimensions or could exert that kind of directed force on steel fencing. We visited 4 more sites that day, crisscrossing the county in Boyd's patrol car while Sarah documented everything and I interviewed the property owners. Each location told the same story with slight variations in detail, but consistent in the fundamentals. Fencing destroyed with overwhelming force, animals killed with violence that exceeded any feeding or territorial behavior, and a complete absence of conventional predator evidence. No scat, no urine marking, no territorial scratching on trees, no feeding behavior whatsoever. Whatever was doing this killed for reasons we couldn't determine, and left the carcasses largely intact before departing the area before dawn, without fail. At the 3rd site, a horse farm outside the village of Boone operated by a retired couple named the Morgans, we found something that made Sarah stop mid-sentence and call me over immediately. In the mud near the barn, preserved by recent rain and sheltered from wind by the building's overhang, was a single clear footprint. It measured 14 inches long from heel to toe and 6 inches wide at the widest point across the ball of the foot. The impression showed a distinct heel strike, a pronounced arch, and 5 separate toe marks arranged in a pattern similar to a human foot, but with significant structural differences. The front of the print showed deep gouges where claws had dug into the soft earth when the creature pushed off. Sarah took multiple photographs from different angles using a metric scale for reference and made a detailed plaster cast, using materials from her field kit. Back at the motel that evening, she spent 3 hours comparing the print to every reference database the Bureau maintained for wildlife identification, including specialized databases on exotic animals and escaped zoo specimens. Nothing matched. The size suggested something comparable to a large male grizzly bear standing upright. But bears don't walk bipedally for any significant distance, except in very unusual circumstances, and their hind paw prints don't show the structural features of a plantigrade foot designed for sustained upright locomotion. The arch was too pronounced, the toe arrangement too precise, the weight distribution too human-like. The claw marks were wrong too, positioned and angled in a way that didn't correspond to ursine anatomy or any other known digitigrade or plantigrade mammal. I suggested hesitantly that we might be dealing with someone in a costume, some kind of elaborate hoax designed to scare locals or cover up human criminal activity like theft. Sarah pointed at the photographs of the fence damage and the cattle remains spread across the Peterson farm. She asked me what kind of person could generate that level of force. What kind of costume would leave authentic biological prints in wet mud with proper weight distribution and gait mechanics? I didn't have an answer. That night I couldn't sleep despite being exhausted from the day's work. I lay in the motel room and listened to the wind moving through the trees outside, creating sounds that seemed to shift and change in ways that made my skin crawl. The forest pressed close to the building on 3 sides, and the darkness beyond the parking lot lights was complete and impenetrable. The nearest streetlight was a quarter-mile away. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something moving through the woods behind the motel. At first, I dismissed it as deer or possibly a bear passing through. Normal wildlife sounds that I'd heard plenty of times before. But it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, purposeful, the sound of something large moving with deliberate intent through underbrush and around trees. I went to the window and pulled the curtain back slightly. The parking lot was empty except for our sedan and Boyd's patrol car, which he'd left there for our use. The tree line was perhaps 50 yards away, dark and impenetrable. I watched for several minutes and saw nothing visible, but the sound continued, circling the motel at a consistent distance. The footfalls were heavy enough to crack branches. Then it stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt charged with presence, as if the thing making the noise had become aware it was being observed and had frozen to assess the situation. In the morning, I mentioned it to Sarah over coffee at the diner. She looked at me with tired eyes and said she'd heard it too. Had been awake most of the night listening to something circling our building. We agreed not to mention it to Boyd yet, not until we had something more concrete than sounds in the darkness. Sheriff Boyd called at 8 o'clock to say there'd been another incident during the night. A farm 6 miles west of town had been hit. The owner, a man named Daniel Kemper, was shaken but physically unharmed. His sheep, however, were not. 12 animals dead. We drove out immediately, following Boyd's directions down increasingly rough roads until we reached a property that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The scene we found was the worst we'd encountered. 12 sheep dead, scattered across the pasture and dragged into the woods beyond in trails of blood and wool. The violence exceeded anything that could be rationalized as predation. The animals hadn't just been killed, they'd been destroyed, pulled apart, thrown against trees with enough force to break bones, crushed into the ground. The pasture showed evidence of a prolonged struggle, deep furrows where hooves had scrambled for purchase while being dragged toward the forest. Blood soaked the grass in patches 20 feet across. Wool hung from tree branches 15 and 20 feet above the ground, where bodies had apparently been thrown or carried. At the center of the kill zone, pressed deep into soft earth near the barn, we found 3 more prints in a line suggesting a walking gait. These were clearer than the first, showing detail that made cold sweat break out across my back despite the morning chill. The prints showed a foot structure that was neither fully human nor fully animal, but something in between, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd learned about mammalian biology. The toes were elongated compared to human proportions and showed both human-like flexibility in the joints and heavy claw reinforcement at the tips. The arch was pronounced and well-defined, designed to absorb impact from bipedal running and walking. The heel was wide and showed a texture pattern in the mud that suggested thick, calloused skin or possibly dense fur, creating a distinctive impression. The depth of the prints suggested significant weight, well over 300 pounds based on how far they'd sunk into ground that wasn't particularly soft. These were not costume prints created by someone walking on stilts or wearing prosthetics. They were biological impressions made by a living creature that walked habitually on two legs and had the strength to destroy steel fencing and kill large livestock with its bare hands and teeth. I photographed them extensively, measured every dimension I could think of, and tried desperately to fit them into some framework of known species or at least known animal families. I failed completely. There was nothing in the natural world that matched what we were seeing. Sarah wanted to stake out the next likely target and attempt to observe whatever was responsible. We studied the pattern of attacks carefully, plotting them on Boyd's county map and looking for commonalities beyond the obvious. She identified a cluster of farms in a roughly 5-mile area that hadn't been hit yet, but fit the profile perfectly. Isolated properties bordering state forest land, livestock kept in outdoor pens, limited visibility from main roads, and no close neighbors who might witness an attack. She proposed we set up observation posts with night vision equipment and wait for the creature to strike again. Statistical analysis of the attack pattern suggested we had perhaps a 70% chance of an encounter within 3 nights if we positioned ourselves correctly. I agreed to the plan, though part of me hoped desperately that we'd find nothing, that the attacks would simply stop and we could file a report blaming wild dogs or a pack of unusually aggressive coyotes. We didn't tell Sheriff Boyd our specific plan. We simply informed him we'd be conducting overnight surveillance at selected locations and would maintain radio contact on secure frequencies. He nodded slowly and told us to be extremely careful out there. The way he said it, the emphasis on extremely, made me think he knew more than he was willing to say, that perhaps he'd seen or heard things himself that he couldn't put in an official report. We chose a farm owned by a man named Marcus Webb, 63 years old. Living alone with 40 head of beef cattle and a small flock of chickens he kept mostly for eggs and company. His property was 120 acres bordering state forest land on 2 sides and a narrow county road on the 3rd. The barn sat on a slight rise with clear sight lines across the pasture in 3 directions and good concealment for observation. Webb agreed to let us use his hayloft after we explained we were conducting a wildlife investigation. We didn't tell him what we thought we might see. We arrived an hour before sunset with our equipment, night vision binoculars with 3rd-generation image intensification, a military-grade thermal imaging camera borrowed from the Bureau's tactical unit, digital recording devices with low-light capability, and our service weapons. Sarah had argued for tranquilizer rifles, the kind used for sedating large animals. I'd vetoed it on grounds that we had no idea what dosage would be effective or safe, and I wasn't willing to partially immobilize something that might then become more dangerous in its incapacitated state. The first night passed without incident beyond the normal sounds of the forest and the nervous behavior of the cattle. We maintained watch in 2-hour shifts while the other rested as much as possible on the hay bales. The cattle grazed and slept normally. No unusual sounds came from the forest. By dawn we were tired, cold, and beginning to question whether our statistical analysis had been wrong. We returned to the motel, slept through the morning and early afternoon, and came back to Webb's farm the 2nd evening. This time I had a feeling in my gut that we wouldn't be waiting long. The air felt different, charged in a way I couldn't rationally explain, but that my instincts recognized. The cattle were nervous from the moment we arrived, clustering together near the barn instead of spreading out across the pasture as they had the previous night. They shifted and lowed with increasing agitation as darkness fell. Around 10 o'clock, their behavior escalated significantly. They began moving in tight circles, pressing against each other, making distress sounds that carried clearly across the field. Sarah raised the thermal camera and began scanning the tree line methodically, sweeping from left to right in overlapping sections. Nothing showed for several minutes except the normal heat signatures of small animals, and the residual warmth of sun-heated rocks. Then she touched my arm hard and pointed without speaking. On the thermal display, a heat signature appeared at the forest edge, roughly 200 yards from our position. It was large, approximately 7 feet tall when standing fully upright, and it stood on 2 legs with a posture that was unmistakably bipedal. The thermal image showed a body mass and heat distribution consistent with a large mammal weighing somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds. The signature was distinct and bright against the cooler background, indicating it was warm-blooded and generating significant metabolic heat. It stood absolutely motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, and I had the unnerving sense that it was watching the cattle, assessing them, making calculations about which ones were most vulnerable. Then it moved, and the way it moved made my breath catch, not with the lumbering side-to-side gait of a bear, but with a smooth, purposeful stride that covered ground quickly and efficiently, each step deliberate and controlled. I grabbed the night vision binoculars with hands that had started shaking and aimed at the approaching figure. What I saw through the green-tinted optics made me forget to breathe for several seconds. It was bipedal and covered in what appeared to be dark fur or hair that was thicker around the neck and shoulders, creating a mane-like appearance. The body structure looked canine from the head and shoulders, but became progressively more anthropomorphic through the torso and limbs. The head was massive and shaped distinctly like a wolf's skull, but larger, much larger, set on a thick neck that merged into powerful shoulders that suggested enormous strength. The arms were disproportionately long and ended in hands that clearly possessed opposable thumbs and individual fingers tipped with visible claws. It moved with a loping gait that was both alien and eerily familiar, each stride covering what I estimated to be 8 or 10 feet. The cattle saw it and panicked completely. They scattered in all directions, their collective fear creating chaos as they trampled over each other, trying to escape, some running toward us, others toward the far end of the pasture. The creature reached the fence in seconds, crossing the open ground with terrifying speed. It didn't slow down or hesitate. It grabbed the top rail of the fence with both hands in a grip that looked casual and vaulted over in a single fluid motion that would have been physically impossible for anything its size and mass according to normal biomechanics. It landed inside the pasture on 2 feet with perfect balance and immediately focused its attention on a young heifer that had become separated from the others and was running in panicked circles. What happened next occurred with such speed that I almost couldn't track it even through the night vision optics. The creature closed the distance in 3 explosive bounds that covered 50 feet in less than 2 seconds. It caught the heifer by the neck with both hands, lifted the 600-pound animal partially off the ground, and brought it down with a violent twisting motion that broke its spine with an audible crack. The sound carried clearly across the field in the still night air. The heifer's cry was cut off instantly. The creature didn't feed on the kill. It didn't even pause to examine what it had done. It simply released the body and moved immediately toward the next target with the same focused purpose. Sarah was recording everything with the digital camera, her breathing fast and shallow beside me in the darkness of the loft. I could hear the slight whir of the camera mechanism and the soft sounds of her trying to control her fear. The creature took down 2 more cattle in less than a minute, each kill executed with brutal mechanical efficiency. A mature bull that weighed over 1,000 pounds died as easily as the heifer, its neck broken with the same twisting motion. Then the creature stopped its assault and lifted its head, standing perfectly still among the bodies of its victims. For a long moment it remained frozen in that position. I realized with creeping horror that it had detected our presence. Its head turned slowly in our direction with deliberate precision. Even through the night vision, I could see its eyes reflect the ambient starlight, 2 points of luminescence in the darkness that seemed to glow with their own internal light. It stared directly at our position in the hayloft, 40 feet above the ground and 100 yards away. My hand moved to my service weapon without conscious thought. I drew the Glock from my hip holster and held it ready with my finger along the trigger guard, though I had absolutely no illusion about what a 9mm round would do against something that could snap a bull's spine with its hands. The creature made a sound then that I'll hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. A vocalization that started as a low growl deep in its chest and rose into something between a howl and a scream, a sound that seemed to combine the worst elements of both and create something entirely new and terrifying. The volume was impossibly loud, carrying a physical force that I felt as a pressure wave in my chest and a vibration in the wooden beams around us. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, building in intensity and pitch, and then cut off abruptly as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was broken only by the terrified sounds of the surviving cattle running blindly in the darkness, crashing into fences and each other in their panic. The creature dropped to all fours, which I hadn't expected it could do based on its body structure. On 4 legs it moved even faster, its gait becoming that of a wolf or large dog but maintaining impossible speed for something its size. It loped toward the barn, closing the 100 yards between the pasture and our position in what couldn't have been more than 8 or 10 seconds. I heard it hit the barn wall directly below us, heard the old boards crack and splinter under an impact that shook the entire structure. Sarah made a decision in that instant that probably saved both our lives. She triggered the spotlight we'd mounted on a tripod, a 1,000,000 candle power searchlight designed for search and rescue operations. The beam cut through the darkness like a physical thing and illuminated the creature at the base of the barn wall. For the first time, we saw it clearly, completely, and in full detail. It stood perhaps 7.5 feet tall, when upright, covered in dark brown fur that was thick and coarse, growing denser around the neck and shoulders to form a distinctive mane. The head was distinctly canine, with a long, powerful muzzle, erect ears that swiveled independently to track sounds, and a mouth full of teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. The teeth were visible even with the mouth partially closed, long canines that caught the light. The body was humanoid from the shoulders down, with a broad chest that showed defined musculature under the fur, a narrow waist and legs that showed both human and canine characteristics in their structure and articulation. The arms were disproportionately long, reaching nearly to the knees, and heavily muscled in a way that suggested incredible strength. The hands were the most disturbing feature, 5 fingers including a fully opposable thumb, each tipped with a curved black claw that looked capable of disemboweling a man with a single swipe. The hands were large enough to grip a basketball with ease. It looked up at us in the spotlight beam, and I saw intelligence in its eyes that went far beyond animal cunning. Not human intelligence exactly, but something that approached human awareness and cognitive function. It studied us for a long moment, its expression shifting in ways that suggested it was processing information and making decisions. Then it raised one clawed hand and drove it into the barn wall with devastating force. The wood exploded inward, sending splinters flying. It pulled its hand back and struck again in a slightly different location, creating a hole large enough for it to climb through if it chose. The blows were controlled and precise, not random rage but calculated destruction. Sarah was screaming at me to fire, to shoot it, to do something, but I was frozen in a kind of terrified paralysis. Part of me understood with absolute clarity that shooting this thing would only make it angry, and angry was the absolute last thing we wanted it to be. It was choosing not to attack us, making a conscious decision to demonstrate its capability without following through. Shooting it would eliminate that choice. It looked at us one more time, its eyes meeting mine across the distance. I felt that gaze like a physical touch, a moment of connection that conveyed awareness and intention. Then it made a huffing sound, a sharp exhalation that might have been a challenge or a warning or simply acknowledgement of our presence. It turned away from the barn in a movement that was almost casual and loped back toward the tree line on all fours. We tracked it with the spotlight as long as we could, watching its dark form move across the pasture and disappear into the forest. Sarah kept the thermal camera trained on its heat signature as it moved deeper into the trees, tracking it until the dense canopy and distance made the signal too faint to follow. When it was finally gone, she shut off the spotlight and the camera and sat back against the hay bales. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the equipment. Mine were too. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the dying sounds of the cattle's panic and our own racing hearts and the slow return of normal forest sounds. Neither of us could speak. What words existed for what we'd just witnessed? Finally, after what might have been 5 minutes or 30, I asked her if she'd gotten clear footage. She nodded slowly, not looking at me, staring at the camera in her hands. I asked if she believed what we'd just seen, if she could accept it as real. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was very quiet, almost a whisper. She said she didn't have a choice about belief anymore. Belief wasn't optional when you had video documentation and your own eyes, and every instinct screaming that what you'd seen was impossible but true. We'd documented something that wasn't supposed to exist according to every established scientific principle, and now we had to decide what to do with that information. We had to decide whether to follow protocol and report exactly what we'd witnessed, or whether to bury it and pretend we'd seen nothing. Neither option felt safe or right. We left the barn at first light after documenting the scene and checking on the surviving cattle. 3 were dead, killed exactly as we'd witnessed through our optics. The holes in the barn wall were real, the claw marks deep and unmistakable, gouged into hardwood that should have resisted anything short of power tools. We measured them, photographed them, took samples of the wood fibers. Marcus Webb found us there and stood looking at the damage without speaking for a long time. Finally, he asked what the hell had done this. I looked at Sarah and saw in her eyes the same question I was asking myself. What do we tell him? We settled on a compromise with the truth, saying we'd observed a large unknown predator, possibly a wolf-dog hybrid of unusual size. He looked at the holes in his barn wall and said no dog he'd ever seen could do that. I agreed and said we were calling in additional resources. He nodded slowly and said he'd be sleeping with his rifle for the foreseeable future. I told him that was probably wise. We drove back to town in silence, Sarah clutching the camera equipment like it was the only solid thing in a world that had just revealed itself to be far stranger and more dangerous than either of us had imagined. At the motel, we locked the door, closed the curtains, and reviewed the footage on Sarah's laptop. The thermal imaging was clear and detailed, showing the creature's approach, its attack on the cattle, and its demonstration at the barn wall. The spotlight footage was grainier due to the distance and the limitations of the camera's low-light capability, but it showed the creature's features well enough to identify its major anatomical characteristics. We had physical evidence in the form of plaster casts and photographs of prints. We had video documentation from 2 different cameras. We had eyewitness testimony from 2 federal agents with unblemished records. By any reasonable standard of evidence, we had proof of something that would rewrite biological science and challenge every assumption about what species exist in North America. The question was whether anyone would believe us, and more importantly, whether anyone in authority would want to believe us. I called headquarters using the secure satellite phone we'd been issued for the assignment. I reached Morrison's direct line and told him we needed to speak immediately on an encrypted channel about a development in the case. He arranged a callback within the hour using equipment that would ensure our conversation couldn't be intercepted or recorded by outside parties. When he came back on the line, I briefed him on everything we'd observed and documented. I described the creature in clinical detail, explained the pattern of kills and the evidence we'd collected, and told him we had video documentation that clearly showed a bipedal creature of unknown species killing livestock. The line was silent for what felt like a very long time after I finished talking. I could hear Morrison breathing on the other end, could almost feel him processing the information and trying to decide how to respond. Then he asked me a question I didn't expect and didn't fully understand at the time. He asked if anyone else knew what we'd seen. I said no, just Sarah and me. And maybe Marcus Webb had some idea, but we hadn't told him specifics. Morrison told me to stay at the motel and wait for instructions. He said someone would contact us within 24 hours. He told me very clearly and explicitly not to share the footage with anyone, including local law enforcement, and to maintain absolute communication security. Then he hung up without saying goodbye. The next 18 hours were the longest of my life. Sarah and I stayed in the motel, taking turns sleeping and watching the parking lot for anyone approaching. We didn't know what to expect. Part of me thought we'd be recalled to Detroit for debriefing with senior bureau officials and possibly scientists from other agencies. Part of me wondered if they'd send a team to investigate the creature, to attempt capture, or at least further documentation. What I didn't expect, what I never could have anticipated, was what actually happened. At 4 p.m. on our second day of waiting, 3 black SUVs with tinted windows pulled into the motel parking lot in a tight formation. 6 men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, along with 2 individuals in military uniforms without insignia or unit patches. They weren't FBI. I recognized immediately the bearing and equipment of special operations personnel, the way they moved and scanned their environment. The lead suit identified himself as Deputy Director Williamson, from a division of the Department of Defense I'd never heard mentioned in any briefing or training. He asked for the footage and all related documentation in a tone that made it clear this was not a request. We handed it over because we had no choice and no grounds for refusal. Williamson reviewed the thermal footage on a ruggedized laptop one of his people provided, watching without expression or comment. He watched the entire sequence twice, including the spotlight footage, then closed the computer and looked at us with eyes that showed nothing. He said what we'd encountered was a classified biological entity that fell under the purview of national security protocols established in 1952 under executive order. He said our investigation was now officially closed and that all materials related to it, including our personal notes and observations, were being confiscated under federal authority. He told us we were prohibited from discussing what we'd seen with anyone, including other Bureau personnel, under penalty of federal prosecution for disclosure of classified information. The classification level was above top secret, in a category that had no official designation. Violation would result in immediate termination from federal service and potential imprisonment under statutes that weren't public. He handed us non-disclosure agreements that had already been signed by a federal judge whose name I recognized. We had no choice but to sign. I asked what they were going to do about the creature, about the threat it posed to civilians. Williamson said that wasn't our concern and that the matter was being handled by personnel with appropriate clearance and training. I pressed him, said there were people living in this area who had a right to know what was out there, that we had an obligation to protect the public. He looked at me with cold eyes that had seen things I probably couldn't imagine and said the American people had a right to sleep at night without fear of monsters in the woods. He said disclosure would create mass panic, undermine public confidence in government institutions, and serve no useful purpose beyond satisfying curiosity. The entity would be monitored through existing protocols and, if necessary, contained through methods that were beyond our clearance level and our need to know. Our job was to forget what we'd seen and return to normal duties in Detroit. He made it very clear through tone and body language that our careers, our freedom, and possibly our lives depended on our compliance with these instructions. There would be no second warning. Sarah asked if there were others like the creature we'd encountered. Williamson hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and in that brief pause I saw confirmation of what I'd already begun to suspect. There were others. This wasn't an isolated incident or a unique anomaly, but part of something larger and older, something the government had been managing and covering up for decades. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he told us that certain phenomena exist in the margins of human experience, in the places where civilization meets true wilderness, and that some knowledge serves no useful purpose except to destabilize the social order and create fear. He said we'd done our job by identifying and documenting the threat. Now it was time to let others with specialized training and resources handle the response. Then he and his people left, taking every piece of evidence we'd collected. The camera equipment, the plaster casts, the photographs, our handwritten notes, our laptops, everything. They even confiscated our personal cell phones and issued us new ones with different numbers, presumably to eliminate any possibility that we'd transmitted information before their arrival. The message was clear. This had never happened, and we had never been here. We returned to Detroit the next day under instructions to resume our normal duties. Our official report, written by someone we never met and delivered to us for signature, stated that we'd investigated livestock killings in Wexford County attributed to wild dogs or possibly coyotes, and found insufficient evidence to support federal involvement. The case was closed and referred back to local authorities for continued monitoring. Sheriff Boyd never contacted us again. I tried calling his office once several weeks later and was told he'd taken early retirement for health reasons. The livestock killings stopped completely after our encounter with the creature, as if whatever had been doing them had finished its business in that area or been driven away by forces we weren't allowed to know about. Sarah transferred to the Boston field office 6 months later, requesting a change of assignment for personal reasons that she never explained to me. We never discussed what happened in Michigan, not even in private conversations where we might have thought we were safe from surveillance. The weight of the classification hung over us like a physical presence, a constant reminder that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. I stayed with the Bureau for another 16 years, working cases that felt increasingly meaningless compared to what I knew was out there in the darkness. I worked organized crime, white-collar fraud, public corruption. Good cases with clear outcomes and definable enemies that stayed dead when you put them away. I never took another assignment in Michigan or anywhere near it. Whenever files crossed my desk involving unusual wildlife activity or unexplained animal attacks, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach and a voice in my head asking if some other agent was being sent to encounter what we'd encountered. I wondered if other agents before us had seen similar things and been silenced the same way. I wondered how many cases existed in classified archives that would never see daylight. How many truths were buried under classification stamps and non-disclosure agreements signed at gunpoint. The job I'd loved became a reminder of institutional cowardice and the deliberate suppression of reality in service of an illusion of control. I retired in 2003 at the age of 56, earlier than I'd originally planned, but as soon as my pension vested. Sarah had left the Bureau the year before, moved to Seattle, and opened a private investigation firm specializing in background checks and insurance fraud. We spoke once after her departure, a brief phone call where neither of us said what we really wanted to say. She told me she'd been having nightmares about the creature for years, seeing those eyes looking up at us from the darkness below the barn, hearing that howl scream in her sleep. She said she couldn't continue working for an organization that would rather protect its secrets than protect its people from the truth. I told her I understood completely. We wished each other well and hung up. I never heard from her again. I heard through informal networks that she'd closed her firm after a few years and moved overseas, possibly to New Zealand. I hope she found some kind of peace. I haven't. Now I'm 73 years old with more years behind me than ahead. The statute of limitations on my non-disclosure agreement expired 5 years ago, according to the letter of the law, though I'm certain there are people in unmarked offices who would prefer I remain silent regardless of legal technicalities. I'm coming forward now because I'm old and tired and fundamentally sick of carrying this secret. The American people deserve to know that creatures like the one we encountered exist, that they're documented in classified files, and that the government has chosen to hide that fact rather than address it openly and honestly. I don't know how many of these beings are out there in the wilderness areas that still exist. I don't know if they're related to the legends of werewolves and dogmen that have circulated in folklore for centuries across multiple cultures. I don't know if they're natural evolutionary developments, some kind of relic species that survived in isolated populations, or something else entirely that we don't have categories for. What I do know with absolute certainty is this. In March of 1987 in the woods of northern Michigan, I saw something that shouldn't exist according to established scientific understanding. It was intelligent in a way that went beyond instinct. It was powerful beyond anything I'd encountered in 2 decades of law enforcement. It was capable of violence that exceeded normal predation by orders of magnitude. It killed with purpose and precision rather than hunger. It was aware of us, studied us carefully, and chose not to attack despite having every advantage and opportunity. The footage we captured was real and genuine. The evidence we collected was authentic, and all of it was seized and buried by people who decided the truth was too dangerous for public consumption. That decision wasn't made to protect civilians from panic. It was made to protect government authority and institutional control from questions they couldn't answer. I'm sharing this testimony now knowing it will be dismissed by many as the confused memories of an old man, as attention-seeking behavior, or as an elaborate hoax. I don't care about those dismissals. I know what I saw with my own eyes. Sarah Chen knows what she saw. Marcus Webb knows something destroyed his barn wall. The families who lost livestock know something was out there that local authorities couldn't explain, and somewhere in a classified facility whose location I was never told, there's footage of a creature that rewrites our understanding of what lives alongside us in the American wilderness. That footage won't be released in my lifetime, or probably anyone else's, but maybe eventually enough people will come forward with their own experiences that the accumulated weight of testimony will become impossible to ignore. Maybe someone with more courage than Williamson and his people will decide that we deserve to know what shares this world with us. Until then, I'll tell you what I tell anyone who asks about camping or hiking in the northern woods of Michigan or any other wilderness area where these things might exist. Be careful at night, stay near your fire, pay attention to the sounds around you, especially sounds that don't fit normal wildlife patterns. If you hear something large moving through the forest with rhythmic, purposeful stride, don't investigate. Don't assume it's a bear or a deer. Don't convince yourself it's your imagination. Trust your instincts, which evolved over millions of years to detect predators, and get somewhere safe with walls and locks and other people, because there are things out there that our government knows about and chooses to hide from us. Things that hunt in the darkness and leave behind nothing but questions and fear, and the certainty that we're not alone in these woods. Things that watch us with eyes that reflect light like an animal's, but hold intelligence that's far too human for comfort. The Michigan Dogman is real. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've documented it with equipment that doesn't lie. And I've watched the truth about it disappear into the machinery of government secrecy and institutional denial. This testimony is my attempt to pull back that veil, even slightly, even knowing it probably won't make any difference. I don't expect to change policy or force disclosure of classified materials, but I owe it to the people who've encountered these creatures and were told their experiences didn't matter, who were dismissed as crazy or attention-seeking or drunk. Your experiences were real. What you saw was real, and you deserve to have that acknowledged, even if it's just by one old federal agent who can no longer stay silent about what he knows. For more stories like this, consider subscribing.